All right, so Module A for Standard is involved with this idea of experience through language. It's very important we consider that terminology first. It requires you to explore issues of a particular aspect of language, okay? And that's really important, a particular aspect of language. And so your response should always be focused on that particular idea, an aspect of language, and constantly responding to how that works, both in your text and in your related text. You develop an awareness of language and help understand how perceptions of and relationships with others and the world are shaped in the language, okay? So here you have perception, and here you have relationships. Knowing full well, therefore, that your Module A question is likely going to focus in on asking you to analyse those ideas in your play, Summer of the 17th Doll. Perceptions of others and the world, relationships within that particular work. And so that's really important. You've got the perception of an Australian identity through the Australian voice. You've got the context of that 1950s time, but you've also got a general Australian way of thinking in this play. And then you have the relationships in this play that are not necessarily and absolutely straightforward and normal. They are very complex and very messy. Now, your elective is distinctive voices. In responding, you consider various types of functions of voices in text. Now, when you see that, you'll note that's a plural. Voices is a plural, okay? So make sure that you are considering a multitude of voices in there, including Ray Lawless. Including Ray Lawless. And then the potential, of course, for any director's voice to participate in a production of this particular piece of work. Don't just focus in on Rue or Barney or Olive or Emma, Johnny or whatever. You need to say, okay, Rue's voice is one particular aspect, as is Olive's, as is Pearl's. They come into conflict. They also come into unity. But then there's something that Ray Lawler was striving to achieve on top of all that at a different layer and a different level. Okay? You explore ways language is used to create these voices and how it affects interpretation. Okay, so the creation of it, and that in your sensibility is characterful stuff. How does people's dialogue create a sense of themselves and how they feel about others? Look for language about themselves and look for language about how they respond to each other. Think of a line like, I'm flamin', stony, rotten, stinkin' broke. And what that means for Rue in terms of his own emaciation, his own representation of his identity through that deprecation and deprecating language. Okay? So let us now consider the play itself. Here we have Summer of the 17th Doll. And the play opens, of course, with the girls getting ready for the boys to arrive. So when we first meet them in the middle of a conversation. Bubba and Pearl are speaking, and Bubba is almost giving us a narration, a catch-up, if you will. Given that this is actually the third part of a trilogy, despite the fact that it was the first play produced in the trilogy, it's still the third part of the story. Now, of course, the other important thing is that we see here it's December 1953, so in terms of its release, it's actually contemporary. This came out in around that time. And you must also consider the Australian voice at that time was a confused one, particularly in the public realm. Australia did not exist on the stage, really. Australia did not exist in art or in any other, in radio or anything like that. This is prior to Australia having television. Australia had television in 1956. So the Australian voice was almost what we'd refer to as received pronunciation. And you might think of a character like Hyacinth Bouquet, Bucket Woman, if you've ever seen that show. She speaks in received pronunciation because it's clearly put on because her family members, her sisters, speak with a heavy northern accent. and therefore she's hiding her true self and identity. For us, we were hiding our identity by speaking almost posh English anytime we went on television. Not television didn't exist, sorry, anytime we went on stage or anything like that. So The Dole is considered really our first play in our own language. It succeeded in England, for instance, on the West End, but it failed massively in America. It did not translate. The English, of course, understood the colonial Australian voice and the colonial Australian identity and who these characters kind of represented. There is, of course, another thing going on contextually here. In 1953, you're at the beginning of the move from a rural Australia to a domestic urban Australia. This, of course, happens in post-World War II in that environment. Australia prior to that was indeed very rural, and our cities were just large country towns. Apart maybe from Sydney. There was a famous saying, you either live in Sydney or you live in the bush. It was this simple dichotomy. There was one or the other. It didn't matter if it was Melbourne, Adelaide, they were country towns compared to Sydney. Now, this is set in Melbourne. It's the beginning of the urbanisation of Australian culture. And so Barney and Roo also represent a mythology, an ideal. And that's something that actually Olive has to come to deal with in her own self and identity. It's something that's thrown at her. These men coming down from the sun, almost like gods, this mythological creature. It's an extraordinary idea. And they're coming out of the past. And that's also played out in Dowd's position in the play, the new guy, the young guy, the stronger guy, the ganger, that kind of thing. Now, of course, the first thing you notice, if you were just to go to the opening couple of phrases, is, of course, the way in which language plays out between Bubba and Pearl. Bubba, who is a native of this part of the world and of Melbourne and has grown up with Olive and Roo and Barney and the unseen, and Nancy, who is now left to get married and left Barney in the lurch. So it's very, very simple and it's obvious, but it's very important to mention. And that, of course, is all this. Any of these bits of language that are presented as broken off because she is a native of this sort of Australian working class world, okay? You don't see this in Pearl's language, okay? You see a very judgmental person who has already made a decision about what kind of world she happens to have stumbled upon. Okay, and one of the things that happens in terms of the dramatic tension is that her suitcase seems to always be staying by the stairs, never going upstairs, never leaving the house. She's in a state of transition. Do I stay or do I go? Is this where I should be? I don't seem to fit in with these people, or at least I don't seem to pretend to fit in with these people. She's a barmaid. That's her only trade, so she's fooling herself in much the same way that many Australians were fooling themselves about their own sophistication. Summer of the 17th Dole, through its distinctive voice, shows no falsity as to who we truly are as a people. It came to ask the question about what an Australian identity was, and for many it meant a sort of dying breed of rural men who drank hard, lived hard, and had their own rules to play. And the urban, conservative style environment starts to overwhelm this identity. And the Australian voice, as you can see, is in conflict with someone like Pearl in this particular scene. Her judgment is very palpable and very much part of this world. Okay, you look at this little part here. Pearl, who says, you've got here, I don't reckon Barney's ever read a book in his life. And Pearl says, turning a page. That delivered on stage, of course, is sardonic and nasty and brutal. Well, I'm fond of a good book myself now and then. And Bubba says, you won't need any. You won't need any. As in, this is the real life. This is not a place that's bookish and intellectual. This is a place where we drink, we have fun, and we party. You will enjoy this. And, of course, the insinuation is that that's not going to be the case for Pearl, and, of course, that turns out to be quite true. As the scene goes on, we see the attraction that Olive has to these men and the language that surrounds it, okay? All around the world, all around would be the regulars, soft city blokes having their drinks and their little arguments, and then in would come Roo and Barney. They wouldn't say anything, didn't have to. They'd be just the two of them walking in with the wait for a second or two and be quiet. And after that, without a word, the regulars would stand aside and let them through as if they were a couple of kings. She always said they made the rest of the fellas in the bar look like a bunch of skinned rabbits. It goes on, I'd like to ask her right now, with them expected any minute and her sitting chained up like that to that book bloke, I'd like to ask her if she thinks it's worth it. So there's this real derisory language here about the fact that she's chained herself up to one of these ones that would part for her king. She's let herself down in that sort of way. And the language is cursory and nasty. So the voice, as it becomes distinctive, is suggestive of the idea that Olive, at least, believes the real Australia lives in that hard-edged rural fantasy, not in the urbane. And that is therefore showing us a country in conflict with its own identity and its own past. We start to see Pearl speak the same way, or lose her own sort of self there. You can see this here, everything, and it goes on and on like that. So she is starting to actually let her guard down, I suppose, as she continues to speak to Olive. When they do arrive, we see that they, Roo and Barney, are everything that we've been set up for them to be. Okay, they come in loud, wild, brash. And here's an interesting moment. You get this up there, Kazali line, which is a Melbourne thing, to do with AFL, or back then it would have been VFL football. A saying like that only transfers locally. Even a person in Sydney possibly wouldn't have been familiar with that phrase in 1953. But it shows us a very distinctive Melbourne voice, and therefore we get a distinctive idea of context and place and space. Okay? Now this play itself starts to really ring true and shine when Roo and Barney set to each other and their conversation. There's something about, of course, the distinctive voice in terms of the gender, the masculinity, or the hyper-accentuated masculinity that's going on here, as well as the issue with their own sense of hierarchy, knowing that all theatre, of course, is about hierarchy, is about sustaining positions in a hierarchy, and therefore determining what a need and a want is for each character. Now, Roo and Barney here are talking about where Roo has decided to get a job in the city. He gets a job, as you know, in the paint factory. And yes, you can talk about things here that we have, you know, a joke, a bloody joke, you know, the swearing. 1953 is pretty full on and pretty dangerous and pretty taboo, pretty challenging for people. But we get this conversation about Roo not having any money. Barney here says, well, me then, I got money and I don't want your money. I can still own my own, even if I have got a busted back. It's all that lousy rotten pride of yours, ain't it? You're mad at me because I didn't walk out with you up north. I'm not mad at anything. Yes, you are, by God, you are. Mad at me. Twice as mad at young Dad. Got a snout on that kid first time you saw him working. Drop it, will you? Knew what a mistake you'd made in turning off old Tony Marino. Drop it or I'll bash your face in. This harsh, brutal, violent, aggressive language between the two of them, bitingly stung, is the way that Lawler wants them to speak, is very much the crux of how this play works. They're in a state of tension constantly because of the unspoken, because of the elephant in the room, because of the issue. And the elephant in the room is the gradual destruction of Roo, the death of that character of Rue, not necessarily the person, but what he was, the cane cutter, the myth, the great love of Olive, this big, strong man, now overwhelmed by a much younger, fitter, better person, and the very fact that his best mate, such an Australian concept, seems to be turning his back on him. There we have, really, in essence, what most of this play is actually about. It's about the distinctive voice of Rue, and therefore the distinctive voice of the Australian male, how Rue is representative of that. Barney representative, of course, of another type, the drinker and the alcoholic, and this kind of business that's going on. But Rue's character has a stoicism to him and a dignity that is being deteriorated gradually. And he feels undignified when he's covered in paint. You saw him, he's covered in rotten, stinking paint, He's not impressed with this coming down off his pedestal, with this inability now to part the ways in a pub. All right, so the great Australian, the digger, the legend, is being brought down to earth. Keep that in mind when you look at Rue's language, and then the way people speak of Rue, particularly Olive, who defends him stiffly for ages until eventually he betrays her, and she sees him for what he really is and what he truly is in the final devastating scene when all the beauty is stripped from the set and all the areas are bare and the dolls are gone except for the 17th. That moment for Olive tells us that she has stopped believing the myth. She has moved away from the reality or from the mythical ideal of what she's set up and therefore what we've all set up. So Lawler's point is to say that as an Australian society, we're moving away from our first or second type of rural mythology into a more urbane self. So the Australian distinctive voice here is an archaic one. It is one that is something of a relic. Another important part is where Pearl and Barney actually come to a discussion argument. There's never any indication that Pearl's even remotely interested in him, and the setup is frankly absurd, and it seems to be a total misstep on Olive's part, and it clearly is. And here she is discussing the issue of Barney having these children that he decides he's looking after because he pays for their lives, but he's not in their lives. This is ethically and morally an issue, of course, and in 1953, an extraordinary one. And so, again, what's happening is Lawler is giving us an Australian voice that is, again, messy and ugly and not perfect. He's showing us the underside of who we truly are, and usually are in our regular selves. Barney here, who is one of Olive's heroes, is actually a bit of a sleaze, and he's pretty awful, a no-hoper, not where women are concerned. That's a pretty dreadful line on Barney's part. Not dreadfully and poorly written, but dreadful thing for that character to say. And so Barney, in our context, is seen very much in the negative. And in 1953, I'm sure it would have been the same, but of course there were possibly a couple of different ways of looking at things. But we don't consider Barney at any point to have that same status as Rue, and this is one of the reasons for it. His voice is that of what Pearl refers to quite clearly is the no-hoper. Okay? These guys have never done anything to suggest they've grown up. And that possibly is another thing that Lawler is suggesting about our own selves, that Australia is still very adolescent. And in 1953, it really was, in societal and cultural terms, adolescent. It did not have the sophistication, at least that we attempt to have these days, which I don't know if we do or don't, but that's up to you. Finally, in Act 3, you have Rue having to face who he is, and really Emma is the voice of reason and possibly the voice of Lawler. He's put himself into that character, and his voice is there, judging his protagonist, his Rue. You don't just mean the blue last night, but what went on before, and I mean, who's to blame for messing up the whole thing? You're kidding, aren't you? You can talk to the language there, of course, in terms of the blue and all this Australianism that's still there, which is very distinctive, which reminds us of, but that's what Roo is representing, okay? It's very important that you extend from that. You don't just say, oh, he speaks with Australianisms. You actually imply what that means, how that shapes meaning. That's the key. That's really important. No, fair dinkum, got me all boxed up. I want to know. Well, I'll be blowed. How long did you think these layoff seasons were going to last? They're not for keeps. They're just seasons. Righto. But whose fault was it that we came a cropper? Nobody's fault, you melon. Must be somebody's. Why must it? All that's happened is you've gone as far as you can go. You, Barney, Olive. You're too old for it anymore. Oh? For what it is you're up to, that's it. Old. Nobody tells me I'm old. I'm as good a man as I ever was. And this denial, even to the point where he's not even seeing what's around him, that the world around him has actually disappeared. He's in a space where everything around him has been brought down off the walls, and he still can't see it. And Emma's saying, you can't possibly be missing this issue. That's the real issue here. That's the real concern. Okay? So keep those things in mind and always look to what the voices and the characters are doing to shape meaning and what they represent in a broader context.